Mm. Okay, we are live and direct from Queen. You can see it's morning time. Welcome to all of the new followers that's been coming in. Appreciate everybody, tapping in with us as we continue to build on this Afro Literature 101. We're doing this every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for the next 2 months, all the way until October 2nd. So you guys can continue to tap in, and we're going to continue to watch the community grow and grow as I continue to embark on this, this information journey that I would like to share with you all. But yeah, I just want to say Sunny Bunan to those in at the Queen. It's morning time, and anybody watching from abroad, good afternoon, good evening. I am Mr. Responsible. And yeah, we go through this reverse engineering of African literature, and we've been going through classes so far from Monday and Wednesday, and today we're just going to continue that progress. Basically, what we left off is basically, going through this magic trick that is happening on African Americans that's giving them some level of amnesia of Africa. And in this aspect, you can kind of get a sense of, what is, battling the African American for them to kind of separate from the African diaspora and have them more want to assimilate to American culture. And that is one side of the magic trick, but also the other side of the magic trick is the Ubuntu magic within the African American that, helps them be able to still tap in with their African roots. So this is something that we've just been exploring in terms of my journey as an African American that's ngihlala eThekwini amayakanani. I've been living in South Africa for 4 years, and ngiphume phesheya edolobheni encane in New Orleans. And in New Orleans, I have like some level of understanding that we have subconscious triggers that would tell us, okay, Africa is in your past, whether it's the Congo Square in downtown New Orleans or it's the Mardi Gras parade where they have a Zulu parade every year. And like subconsciously we have some level of relics that tell us about the culture that we're from, but in terms of a lot of Americans that have African Americans, they don't really have any connection to Africa that reminds them of who they are, so they just easily assimilate into African American culture without having any reference to who they truly are. And that's something that we're just trying to explore in terms of reverse engineering articles where I've documented my experience from living in South Africa for 4 years, and what was my mind state before and how I've like evolved since then. So in sense of that, I just want to welcome those that are new to this channel. I've seen a lot of people have joined as of recent, so this is just trying to give you guys an idea of what you can expect going forward. Every morning around this time, I kind of go live either here from my desk where I break down literature, or I go on morning hikes where basically we would just go through the mountains of eThekwini where I live at, and just kind of show you guys, how I'm living. So today we're going to be doing a little bit of reading. It may be a little fast paced and maybe heavy for the morning, but this is kind of what we do here, just kind of start your morning on a good trajectory. Um, so where we left off was basically talking about you know, the Christian aspect that is also an element of, helping African Americans assimilate into a culture that is keeping them now resistant. And I've seen that also happen in Africa as well. Like as much as people do practice their traditional customs, they do have a good population that is, Christianized. And in that, they're kind of replacing basically their ancestral worship with the worship of a parasocial relationship with Christ, rather than still keeping an acknowledgement of the ancestors. Well, I know in South Africa specifically, they still can go back to their rules, and then they still have the practices of Ingaya where they may still practice their traditional customs. But in America, like we don't really have that separation from city to rural where you can kind of go back and kind of uh, get back to your true roots. Like you either are, fully Christianized and that's the pathway that you're on, and it's not really too much going backwards. So, in the sense of that, you kind of are on this trajectory in America to where, as an African American, you're just transforming into what is the known elements of what you can become. There isn't no organic development outside of what is already placed there for you. So, as an African American, like you may start off, they tell you that, yes, you were African at one point, but you came over here, you now had to go through the slavery process, and then from there you can be assimilated into American and becoming a citizen. And that is like the full range of what you can do as an American citizen. Now you can be a capitalist, you could be a politician, you could be an entertainer. But in terms of some level of organic development that will put you on a chart and a spectrum where they can't really measure what you are, and just see your ability to kind of buck the system. They kind of just know exactly what your capabilities are is when you are fully assimilated into American culture. Rather, if you go on an organic development and leave out of that system, you can kind of develop into something that they may not be able to measure, and now you can become more of a threat to the system, which is not really the goal, but it is something that rather than just being able to be controlled, once you have more of a off the chart, outside of the matrix type of mindset, it's harder for them to kind of measure where you're going to go with your development. And you can see um, that this has happened in South Africa as well, where people are able to maintain basically their cultural development. So they still have their customs that are all the way from previous years before colonialism, before imperialism. And that's kind of like what we're talking about here. And a lot of this is, fed from the feedback that I've been getting from my audience. I engage with my audience, and then they kind of just tell me more and more about, what is the aspects that I may be missing, what context that I can have. And I feed that into my article so that I can be a voice for you guys, on an American stage or wherever that I can share this information so that we can, get people more awake to what's happening in actuality. So let me just start reading here, and then we will move forward. Shout out to those that are on TikTok. And if you want to see the full, reading, you can go to YouTube, and that will help you be able to tap in and yeah, see the full article. Or you can go to Substack and Mr. Responsible. That will help you tap in as well. Okay, let's go. So, escaping the dehumanization exuded in northern Africa by the Arabic branch of this monotheistic conquest partially influenced the southward relocation of previous inhabitants towards the equator, as those who remained either intermarried into the Islamic fold or served as domestic workers. The travelers who resisted surrendering in their own sense of human expression found themselves expanding in directions where the host communities were more familiar. So this is talking about basically that level of transformation that happened amongst people that are more in the southern areas and in the Congo area, where a lot of the even in Western Africa, where a lot of the transatlantic slave trade kind of was sourced from, they kind of emerged and had to move southward because of what was happening in terms of the Northern Africa, where they had more of an Islamic, invasion in terms of being able to convert people into Islam in Northern Africa and the Arabic branch of the monotheistic conquest that was happening in terms of the different religions that was coming in. First, it was more of an Islamic force that kind of started the slave trade, started that practice, and people were kind of moving southward to kind of go away from what was happening in those northern Africa places. And in the midst of that, they would either uh, enter into more of a Western Africa area or more towards the Congo in Southern Africa, where they will see more familiar faces that they can be hosted by versus the Islamic fold that was happening in the Northern area. And in that aspect, basically, like some people didn't rebel against it and they kind of stayed and they were married into the Islamic fold or they would be served as domestic workers. But most people that resisted the surrendering their own sense of humane expression found themselves expanding in directions where the host communities were more familiar. So before the trend of objectifying mankind intensified to the extremities of colonial industrialization, the cultural exchanges that occurred throughout Western, Central, and Southern Africa were drastically less opportunistic. So as the sort of process of this slave trade started to happen, and it started to build more of a dehumanization practice that was being more and more intensified as first the Islamic fold came in, and then more of the British colonialism and imperialism started to come in. This market started to emerge of subjecting humans to be able to serve basically the homeland, and they will create colonies in Africa. And in that aspect, they had exchanges between different cultures before, but there was a way more humane. It was more like they would have more of a equal trade and an equal look at each other versus what was happening once a market emerged to where people can be subjected when they would capture people and all these different things. But that influence was kind of like brought in. It wasn't the original influence of what was happening in Africa of those exchanges before, and even abroad during extended explorations toward less uh to even abroad during expanded explorations toward the Americas that predated Columbus, the imperialistic motives common amongst European nations were not evident in encounters executing reciprocal trades of indigenous produce across the Atlantic. So there's even some evidence of, before Columbus, they have an African exploration to America, but the exchange was a lot more fair and a lot more equal trades rather than what was happening once the Europeans and more the Islamic fold got involved with it. So as that kind of started to emerge more and more, that's what we're going to talk about today. I know it's a heavy topic for this morning, but this is kind of like the ending of our journey throughout the Ubuntu Magic, to where we're talking about three phases of what happened to African Americans, to where they were pledged as this version of themselves. Okay, yes, you are an African American, but you are also rooted in Africa, but like the process of turn, there's 3 stages to a magic trick. It's basically like the pledge where you show somebody something, whether it's an apple or a bird or even a human, and then you make it disappear. That's the turn. And then from the turn, you may have the prestige where you bring it back. And what we're talking about here is the prestige. We're going into the prestige, but in the turn aspect, it's kind of like making you forget about your history and switching the narrative. And this is all kind of supported by basically the market of slave labor that would give them an incentive to be able to go along this process. So that's kind of like what we're building on here. Um, so we're just going to go forward. Once the commercial aspect of slave labor grew more dominant in Africa as a result of the European empires infiltrating the Arabic monopoly of foreign rule, its demand supported the scaling of offered goods to include the supply of captured tribesmen. So this is when we are seeing that there's a growth in terms of the commercial aspect of slave labor, as the Europeans and empires kind of infiltrated the Arabic monopoly on foreign rule. Its demand supported the scaling offered goods to include the supply of captured tribesmen. Internal trade between different colonizing forces increased as this commodity Internal trade between different colonizing forces increased as this commodity class became lawfully justified by the superior court's reinforcement internationally. So there's just an emergence of a certain level of, acceptance of this being a dehumanizing aspect, and people are more so not like seeing like that this is wrong. It's more so being supported because there's a market behind it. There's science that's now backing it up by European archaeologists that are just saying that these people are ability to be subjected. Like this is just being more of a context that is being supportive of what is happening in the slave labor because it's serving, the homeland where these colonies are being put. So this is something that, it wasn't practiced until like this something was intensifying further and further as the commercial aspect of slave labor grew and grew and grew. And this is what's leading to like the emergence of the transatlantic slave trade and even some level of African, people being involved in the trade of their own people. So like once this migration passage goes on, before the migrations was happening, it was more of an equal, exchange that was happening. But once this Islamic and European, slave trade kind of like emerged and kind of grew bigger and bigger, it started to switch how people would act towards each other, and the dehumanization of man against each other kind of, progresses further and further. And that is something that I feel like is a part of what we're trying to, combat in terms of this Ubuntu magic, which is more of a representation of a Southern African spirit that is more hospitality and more of a, acceptance of people, non-judgment, non-dehumanization. Like even in the education space or even in, just the working environment, like there is a level of being able to have this type of work without everybody being subjected to a boss or, somebody having to look up to a teacher. Like it has to be more of an equal exchange and a dialogue that takes place versus it just being a one-sided argument that everybody just has to absorb. Because this is how you want to actually, impact people, in my opinion, by basically dialoguing with people. And that's kind of like the purpose of AFRO-LIT 101, is to kind of have this dialogue. And in the midst of what I'm going to be being able to express, I'm also backing it with the research from my dialogue with the people. So it's more of an exchange rather than somebody teaching you. And that is something that I feel like is a part of reversing basically the dehumanization efforts that came about through colonialism, imperialism, and the like. Um, so legal domestication superseded moral indifference, which perpetuated the unintentional blending of the then subservient cultures without documented census data. So while Western African distributed the bulk of human exports that populated the transatlantic market, which strengthens the possibility of ethnic groups from that region making up the majority of the transferred African diaspora, the potential mislabeling and unregistered breeding could distort the accuracy of that assumption. So this is from the feedback that I was getting, like in terms of the term, what happens with African Americans is that you don't even know which area of Africa that you may be originating from. And a lot of people from Africa as well have a misunderstanding of, where the African Americans actually come from. Some of them feel like they come from Western Africa. Some of them feel like they come from the Central Africa, and some of them, see that there's some similar ties to like the Southern Africa aspect. So all of these different things are confusing people to really know what is the origin of African Americans and where they come from. And in the midst of that, this is just helping basically the disconnection commence further and further so that there isn't a narrative that is more supportive of African Americans wanting to go directly to Africa to be able to see who they are. They're more just confused, and then from there they may just abandon the process all in all. But when you actually go to visit Africa, as I've been, like I mentioned, I'm living in South Africa for 4 years. I have a wife that's South African. in the midst of that, I'm able to get ingrained in the culture more and more. And in the aspect of that, I'm able to see, regardless of, that pathway of being, misled in terms of who you actually are. Because I believe my bloodline is more in the Benin, in the Western African area from my ancestry charts. But all in all, there is some aspect of that migration that has happened all over Africa from the Northern African area. So there may be a connection, that I can't just trace. So in the midst of that, I think that we just don't want to, assume that just because we may have bloodline in Benin, that it couldn't have been sourced from the same place that, Southern Africans kind of also migrated from. Like there's a Central Africa where people could have went Western, they could have went, Southern, they could, like there's all type of pathways that could have taken place. And it's very hard to just pinpoint it because of, just the distortion of the history. And additionally, the pedigree records from deeper within the sub-Saharan could also be heavily misinterpreted due to the Aboriginal servants being considered merchandise and their oratorical credentials ending up unfortunately undermined and consequentially unaccounted for. So the oratorical credentials is basically like the clan songs that we kind of speak of and those type of things that make you record your history. But in the aspect of, Western archaeologists, they don't kind of credit this stuff, and it isn't like put into the canon of Western education because they more are focused on the literature, the printing press, and all the stuff that they was able to just qualify as the education that they want to pass down to their descendants from their basically winning the battle against Africa in terms of the colonization and the imperialism. And there's a long record of oratory, literature, or not literature, oratory, just writings and culture and all around just oratory, like oral basically is it's like literature, and then it's orature. Orature is more of the aspect of being able to exude your cultural references through action, through dance, through basically like recitals, all these ceremonies. That is a different type of thing that's been long standing before the printing press and before the literature came about, that is put into Western canonization. And a lot of this stuff is undermined and unaccounted for in the midst of the understanding that African Americans possess, because they aren't tuned into the language, or they not, unless you like, I grew up unfortunately in a Afro-Catholic church where I was able to see basically a Black Christ on my wall at St. Peter Claver in New Orleans. And in the midst of that, they also had some level of kente cloth that we had to wear for our uniform, even though kente cloth, I guess, isn't an original African cloth. But all in all, like they had some subtle, influence to show us that we were having some level of African background. We had the djembe drums that they would play in church, and they also had the liturgical dancers that would do some level of exuding, the orature of African culture. So that is something that is really important in terms of, as a child, when you're in church and you're getting this literature, basically this biblical literature, the thing that's really connecting with you isn't the words that's happening because you're a child. You see basically like the colors, the pictures, the action, the dance. Like that is the aspect that is really powerful for people to really grasp onto as a kid, and that puts subconscious measures in your mind to make you just understand that there's something deeper than this literature that's being told to you. So that is something that is very interesting. Like even my son right now, he loves Michael Jackson. Like on his second birthday, we saw him, taught him this. We took him to go see the Michael Jackson movie, and in the midst of that, ever since then, he's just been really like watching Michael Jackson music videos, and then it's not nothing but the movement. Like Michael Jackson is a moving machine; he's a dancing maniac, and my son just tries to repeat all of the moves, and it's just an energy that happens when that orature of Black culture, because this is African American culture, and it's like this is something that he exudes a different level of expression. Even the words isn't really the most important part, because my son can't understand the language, but he can see the movement. He can see just how magical Michael Jackson is moving, and then he's just trying to replicate that. And that is a version of like how Black African American culture kind of also practices this orature in the midst of the prioritization of literature. That is something that Black African Americans have, culture has put across the world, is that we still have some level of input and influence, even though it maybe not be as much of a literal or a scholarly type of way. It's more in the aspect of hip hop and dance and music and just all around, joy and giving people good vibes. So that is something that, it wasn't accounted for in terms of, the aspect of trying to understand Africa in the midst of the colonialization and imperialization. They kind of just, dismiss that level of culture as being something that could be credited as their pedigree to understand who they are. And now you can see this is a picture that I was able to take in downtown at the Queenie, and just of some brothers that's of the youthful class there in college, and they're basically just was just showing that there is a still level of adapting to the cultural aspect and the cultural literature, whether it be in style and just in like our ability to connect as African Americans to young Southern Africans, that there is still a connection that may take place that's beyond just basically like the traditional pathways. Like we have now emerged into this new cultural aspect that is basically like blending so much influence to where there isn't basically any blockage anymore when we connect with each other, human to human. And that's the difference between the online exchanges that happen. There's a lot more inflated conflict because there isn't that human to human aspect, that Ubuntu spirit that I'm just, trying to say is the prestige that we want to, aim for in terms of fighting against this magician trick of making us lose our African heritage as African Americans. So going forward, scaffolding and identity based upon this intermediate premise is the scaffolding and identity based upon this indeterminate premise is the obstacle faced by those on both coasts born in the aftermath of the obstructive period of time. Capitalistic environments of the contemporary age, crowded with factories and mass production standards, instantly devalue the significance of traditional crafts and skills that may trigger intuitive generational talents into an introverted hobby at best. So this is more so talking about that style and that hip hop and then just the music that we naturally have an act for as people that practice this orature, from centuries before. Now that style in the mass, movement of capitalistic environments that kind of just forces these things to be factorized and mass produced, and that's the standards of something being successful. Now these very talented people aren't able to really, just practice their stuff without it just being a sideline hobby. Like now you have to just focus on that and really like focus on more of a career that's going to make you be able to survive in this capitalistic environment. So the expressionists who break through as anomalies captivate the passion of naturally gifted youth and encourage low probability career paths despite their more indoctrinated parents' reactionary deterrence, knowing the risk isn't guaranteed a reward. So as we move forward, this is kind of like the aspect of what is the real core behind what the AFRO-LIT 101 is. It's basically like giving you some level of being able to base your creativity and your expression in research so that you can have more of a pathway to adapt to this digital environment versus the generations before, like seeing artists and seeing creatives as like starving artists because they have a deterrence that seeing that the risk isn't really, worth the reward, or the reward isn't worth the risk in terms of pursuing a creative path, even though that you may have an inclination to like show your talent and express your talent. It's more of an anomaly for those to become successful in that rather than it being a obvious thing for you. And they kind of push people in Africa and African American cultures to be able to go to like the engineering, the lawyer, the doctor role because that's more of a sure fit. But now the technology is emerging, like the digital wave is kind of, pushing things back to where you can, be more of a creative and make, some level of living with that. But you just have to kind of offer your creativity backed by research, in my opinion. And that's kind of like what we break down in this reverse engineering. Because in the midst of me reading this article, a lot of this is fed back from the insights that I was able to get from my community, and that aspect is basically like the core of what we're trying to get across here is that when you have a creative expression, you want to make sure that it's backed in research so that when you actually are giving it out to people, that there is somebody that you see that it is valuable to, and it's been they have connection points from your research that when they experience your art, whether it's music, whether it's article writing in this sense, novel writing, or even just creating a business, you want to make sure that everything that you're doing is already been validated, that there is a market out there for you to be able to put this out there rather than you just offering it and expecting people to do it off of just their own free will. They need to have some level of full I guess dialogue with you beforehand to be able to see that this is something valuable and that you're considering them in creating your artwork. So before you create anything, and the real core of this is like not letting your ideas linger. There isn't anything that should be lingering in your head. You have to build this muscle because when you let an idea linger and you don't execute on it, it kind of weakens your ability to, turn your ideas into something that is for the world to have. But the process that you would go through to kind of prevent this muscle from weakening is basically like strengthening by doing the first act, which is research. Before, there's no cost to research. That all you have to do is answer questions. You could post something on Instagram. If you don't have the phone, the technology, you can either go out there and do it by hand, and you can just basically like interview people based upon this idea that you may have, and not let it linger in your head, but put some action behind it so that you can get into the execution process. And then once you get into the execution process, you are triggering yourself to see that there is a building process that's going on, and you are getting to the point of being able to put this expression into the world, which is the point of you getting ideas. Like we That is the difference between humans and basically like animals of sense. Like we have the ability to think things and be able to have the tools in the hands and the body to bring those things in our thoughts into, fruit and fruality. I don't know if that's the right word, but into fruition. Yeah, you could bring your ideas into fruition, and that's the real thing that is the key to us. But if we don't do that, we don't practice that muscle, we don't, strengthen that connection with your source that's giving you these ideas by executing, then you are just weakening that muscle. So the idea of backing your creativity by research is really just building a muscle so that you can be able to really influence the world and impact the world with your expression. This is a really good article ending, and I really like this aspect. And I'm going to go into it more tonight at 8:30 to 10:30, so that we can kind of break down fully, how this information is going to help you guys being able to help your creative expression and move us through being able to understand how we're going to be moving through this Afro-Lit 101 throughout the rest of the month, 2 months. So finishing off, I think I have two more paragraphs. Let's see. So the communal appreciation isn't as typical as you would find in the annual celebrations performed in the rural homes of Africa, unless you are raised in a similar church-like environment in the states that also participates in collective praise without the harsh criticism found in professional arts and music industries. So when I was able to visit, in Givakshela, Ikaya, Mginiwami, I was able to visit my friends, home, and I was able to see the rural, cultural, basically customs, and how, a lot of the kids are singing, a lot of the adults are singing songs, and it's like a communal aspect to the singing that you will find, like, if you're an African American, you will find that in the church-like environment, to where there's no judgment in terms of, oh, you can sing good or bad. Like the choir may not sound the best. My choir was fire. I'm not gonna lie. My choir, St. Peter Claver, was one of the blessed black choirs that we would have across New Orleans, and I experienced like real soulful, upbringing in terms of music, which brings me into my love for music today, along with a lot of stuff that New Orleans is just a musically inclined city. But when you go to these rurals and these even not even the rurals in the cities, like you could be in a government hall and they would, break out into song. In a classroom they would break out into song. It's more of a communal aspect of this praise song aspect that is happening in Africa, that is common. And that aspect is something that is very powerful in terms of, combating against the commercial arts or the music industries that are more so, judgmental, and making sure that you have to be a chart standing type of artist to be able to contribute. And that is not really the real practice of the orature of African people. It's like more of a communal aspect. It isn't something that needs to be graded by a chart, or, for you to be successful in it, you have to kind of like go to the standards of being this pop artist. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I appreciate the ability to compete on that level as well, but it's not just the original version of what these, this orature is supposed to be about. Like the orature is basically like the opposite of, not the opposite of literature, but it's like the more non-written literature. It's more of the cultural contribution that you may have, and it's through the oral. It's through, like, either dance or through music, and like it's the same something that you can document. Like how the clan songs of, Africans in Southern Africa are documented in terms of being able to sing these songs to each other, and they can like represent their history through this version of expression. So, um, also the spiritual hymns, in contrast to the secular music marketed to African American demographics, mirrored the testimonial lyrics that help preserve an agreed upon recollection of the authentic African experience that has been memorialized in the enunciated clan songs. So yeah, that is just, finishing off this idea that, outside of the secular music that is more popular today, which is like in your hip hop, and I grew up in a hip hop culture, so I understand the infatuation that we as Black African Americans have with that. And but it's been kind of targeted to us versus like us having more of a testimonial lyrics that you will find in more of the religious music and the spiritual music and the spiritual hymns that we may have, that still, register with me today from having it as a kid. But in the midst of the spiritual hymns, those are things that more mirror this clan song that you will hear in the rules of South Africa or throughout South Africa as a whole. So this is going to be our last paragraph. I thank those that are tuning in. If you want to read this full article, you can go to Substack, and that will help you be able to just see, the full article, or you can go to YouTube where we will be, uploading this full video, and that'll help you be able to just understand more of being able to read along rather than me